The paradox of our age is this: the harder you work, the more efficiently you produce, the more exhausted, anxious, and unfree you become. Society praises productivity as liberation, yet the worker feels increasingly trapped. This is not a failure of character, nor a crisis of motivation. It is the logical outcome of an economic system that survives by extracting life itself from those who labor. You are told that productivity is progress, that long hours are virtue, that sacrifice today will bring freedom tomorrow. But tomorrow never arrives. Instead, every increase in your output tightens the chain around your life. The faster you work, the richer another becomes. The more you give, the less you possess of time, of dignity, of control over your own existence. This contradiction is not accidental. It is the foundation of capitalist society. Under capitalism, labor does not belong to the worker. The product of your hands, your mind, your energy is seized the moment it is created. What you produce stands against you as an alien force, owned and commanded by another. The factory, the office, the platform all appear as neutral spaces of opportunity, yet they are instruments of domination. You do not work to fulfill human needs, you work to expand capital. And capital recognizes only one law: endless accumulation. As productivity rises, technology is praised as a liberator. Machines promise ease, efficiency, abundance. But ask yourself, who truly benefits from this abundance? The worker is not freed, the worker is intensified. Technology does not shorten the working day, it compresses more labor into every hour. Surveillance replaces trust. Metrics replace judgment. The human being is reduced to a measurable unit of output. Your worth is calculated, ranked, optimized, and discarded when no longer profitable. This is why the most advanced societies feel the most suffocating. Productivity grows, yet insecurity spreads. Wealth multiplies, yet poverty deepens. The worker becomes more replaceable precisely because they are more productive. Capital does not reward labor, it disciplines it. It creates a vast reserve of the unemployed and underemployed, a permanent threat hanging over every worker's head, whispering comply or be replaced. Freedom under capitalism is a cruel illusion. You are free, they say, to sell your labor, but not free to live without selling it. You are free to choose your employer, but not free from exploitation. Hunger, rent, debt, and fear enforce obedience more efficiently than any whip. The worker appears legally equal to the capitalist, yet this equality vanishes the moment production begins. One commands, the other obeys. One owns, the other survives. Productivity becomes a weapon because it isolates. Each worker is set against another, competing for wages, promotions, and mere survival. Collective power is fractured into individual desperation. Solidarity is replaced by rivalry. Exhaustion becomes normal. Anxiety becomes personal. And the system whispers its greatest lie, that your suffering is your own fault. But this system did not fall from the sky. It was built through enclosure, theft, colonial plunder, and the violent separation of people from the means of life. Capitalism requires that the many own nothing so that the few may own everything. Private ownership of production is not sacred, it is the root of domination. As long as factories, land, technology, and resources remain in private hands, productivity will always mean intensified exploitation. Yet history does not end with submission. The same process that dehumanizes workers also unites them. Capitalism gathers workers together, disciplines them collectively, and unknowingly trains its own gravediggers. Every workplace is a site of struggle. Every act of cooperation reveals a deeper truth, that production is social, but appropriation is private. This contradiction cannot last forever. The ruling class fears one thing above all else, class consciousness. They fear workers recognizing that their suffering is shared, their power collective, their enemy systemic. That is why they promote distractions, divisions, and false identities. That is why they preach patience instead of justice, resilience instead of resistance. A conscious working class does not beg, it organizes. True freedom does not come from working harder within the system. It comes from transforming the system itself. It comes when production serves human needs, not profit. When labor is no longer coerced by survival but directed by collective decision. When technology shortens the working day instead of intensifying it. When wealth created by all is owned by all. This is not a moral appeal to the powerful. Power never surrenders out of kindness. This is a call to the exploited, the exhausted, the disposable. Organize, unite, build institutions of solidarity stronger than the forces that divide you. Reclaim your time, your labor, your humanity. The question is not why you feel less free as you become more productive. The question is how long you will tolerate a system that thrives on your unfreedom. History moves through struggle, not obedience. And when workers rise together, productivity will no longer be a chain but a tool for collective liberation. Productivity under capitalism is celebrated as the highest form of human achievement yet. For the worker it functions as a mechanism of deepening domination rather than liberation. Every advance in efficiency, every increase in output is presented as progress for society as a whole. But this progress conceals a fundamental asymmetry. The worker does not gain control over their labor or their life through productivity. Instead, they lose it more completely. What increases is not freedom, but the power of capital over human activity. The system does not reward productivity with autonomy, time, or security, because its purpose is not human fulfillment, but accumulation. Under capitalism, labor, power is a commodity sold under conditions of necessity. The worker must sell their capacity to work in order to survive, and this sale transfers control of living activity to the owner of capital. Productivity becomes the measure by which this commodity is evaluated, intensified, and disciplined. The more productive the worker becomes, the more surplus value is extracted from the same unit of time. Wages may stagnate or rise marginally, but the value created far exceeds what is returned. Productivity thus widens the gap between what the worker produces and what the worker receives, expanding exploitation while disguising it as improvement. Technological development sharpens this contradiction. Machines, algorithms, and systems of optimization promise to reduce human effort, yet within capitalist relations they do the opposite. Technology is not introduced to free workers from toil, but to reduce labor costs, accelerate output, and weaken labor's bargaining power. Each innovation increases the pace of work, compresses more tasks into fewer hours, and renders workers more replaceable. Productivity gains become tools of surveillance and control, measuring every movement, every pause, every breath, transforming the worker into an appendage of the production process rather than its master. As productivity increases, the worker's dependence deepens. Higher output does not lead to collective abundance for those who labor, but to concentration of wealth for those who own. The capitalist does not reinvest productivity gains into reducing working hours or improving conditions unless forced to do so. Instead, surplus is accumulated, financialized, and used to expand control over markets, labor, and political institutions. The worker, despite producing more wealth than any generation before, faces longer working hours, rising living costs, and chronic insecurity, revealing that productivity alone has no emancipatory power within exploitative relations. Freedom under capitalism is defined narrowly as formal choice within constraint. The worker is free to compete, free to accept or reject contracts, free to seek better conditions elsewhere, but never free from exploitation itself. Productivity intensifies this unfreedom by raising expectations while eroding stability. The more productive workers become, the more they are pressured to maintain that level under threat of unemployment or replacement. Productivity sets a moving target that disciplines labor endlessly, converting human creativity into a source of anxiety and exhaustion. This process also fragments the working class. Productivity metrics individualize performance, pit workers against one another, and obscure their shared conditions. Collective identity is weakened as success and failure are framed as personal outcomes rather than structural effects. Exploitation becomes internalized as self-blame, while systemic domination disappears behind charts, targets, and incentives. Productivity thus functions not only as an economic mechanism, but as an ideological one, masking class relations beneath the language of efficiency and merit. The irony is that productivity demonstrates the social nature of labor. No worker produces alone. Every increase in output is the result of collective knowledge, shared infrastructure, and accumulated human effort. Yet the benefits of this collective productivity are privately appropriated. This contradiction lies at the heart of capitalist exploitation. Productivity reveals the immense potential of human cooperation while simultaneously denying workers control over its results. As long as the means of production remain privately owned, productivity will continue to strengthen capital's dominance over labor, deepen inequality, and convert human potential into a force that acts against those who create it. The workers' labor under capitalism is not an expression of their will, creativity, or humanity, but an activity compelled by necessity and seized by another. From the moment labor power is sold, the worker loses authority over their own productive life. What they create does not belong to them, neither materially nor socially. The product stands outside the worker as something foreign, something owned, controlled, and exchanged by capital. Labor, which should affirm human potential, instead becomes an external force dominating the very person who performs it. This alienation begins with the separation of the worker from the means of production. The tools, land, factories, offices, and technologies required to create wealth are monopolized by a small owning class. Deprived of direct access to these means, workers are forced to sell their labor in order to survive. This sale is not a free agreement between equals, but a coerced transaction shaped by material deprivation. The worker enters production already dispossessed, and this dispossession defines every aspect of the labor process. Within production, labor no longer belongs to the worker as living activity. It is directed, measured, timed, and disciplined according to the needs of capital. The worker does not decide what to produce, how to produce, or for what purpose. These decisions are made in pursuit of profit, not human need. Labor becomes repetitive, fragmented, and stripped of meaning, reducing the worker to a function rather than a full human being. What should be a conscious act of creation becomes a mechanical expenditure of energy under command. The product of labor intensifies this alienation. What the worker creates confronts them as an alien object, controlled by someone else, and often used in ways that contradict their own interests. The worker may build homes they cannot afford, produce food they cannot eat, or develop technologies that monitor and replace them. The more the worker produces, the more powerful this alien world becomes, while the worker remains powerless within it. Their own activity accumulates as capital that dominates them in return. Alienation extends beyond the workplace into the worker's relation to society and to themselves. When labor is reduced to a means of survival, life outside work becomes merely a recovery period, a brief restoration of energy for further exploitation. Human potential is compressed into narrow functions, while creativity, cooperation, and intellectual development are denied or commodified. The worker becomes estranged not only from their product, but from their own species being, from the capacity to consciously shape the world according to shared human goals. Capital presents this condition as natural and inevitable. Ownership is portrayed as reward, hierarchy as efficiency, and alienation as personal failure rather than structural domination. The worker is told that advancement, motivation, and self-discipline are solutions to their dissatisfaction, obscuring the fact that the problem lies in the organization of production itself. Alienation is individualized, while its systemic causes are concealed. In this way, capital maintains control not only over material production, but over consciousness. The domination of labor by capital is reinforced through competition among workers. By isolating individuals and forcing them to compete for wages and security, collective resistance is weakened. The worker sees others as rivals rather than allies, even though all share the same condition of dispossession. Alienation thus fractures solidarity and turns social relations into market relations, where human worth is measured by productivity and profitability rather than shared humanity. Yet alienation also reveals the instability of capitalism. The system depends entirely on labor, yet denies worker control over it. It relies on collective production, yet concentrates ownership in private hands. The workers' growing awareness of this contradiction gives rise to class consciousness. The recognition that alienation is not an individual misfortune but a social relation that can be changed. Labor does not have to remain alienated. Its domination by capital is a historical condition, not a permanent one, rooted in private ownership and sustained through power rather than necessity. Technological progress is hailed as the great emancipator of humanity, a neutral force that propels society toward ease, abundance, and freedom. Yet within capitalist relations, it functions primarily as an instrument for profit accumulation and control. Technology does not emerge in a social vacuum. It is developed, deployed, and directed by those who own the means of production. Its purpose is therefore shaped not by human need, but by the imperatives of capital. What could reduce labor time, eliminate drudgery, and expand collective freedom is instead used to intensify exploitation and deepen domination. Under capitalism, technology is introduced to increase productivity, but productivity itself is subordinated to profit. Machines are not designed to liberate workers from toil, but to extract more value from fewer workers in less time. Automation does not shorten the working day, it threatens unemployment. Digital systems do not democratize labor, they monitor, measure, and discipline it. Every technological advance becomes a weapon in the hands of capital, strengthening its power over labor while weakening workers' capacity to resist. The promise of technological liberation is contradicted by lived reality. Workers find themselves working faster, under constant surveillance, subject to algorithms that dictate pace, evaluate performance, and determine worth. Human judgment is replaced by metrics, and complexity is reduced to numbers. Technology fragments labor into tasks optimized for efficiency rather than meaning, stripping work of autonomy and creativity. The worker adapts to the machine, not the machine to the worker, reversing the very logic of progress. Technological development also intensifies inequality. As productivity increases, wealth does not flow to those who produce it, but accumulates in the hands of those who own the technology. A small class controls platforms, data, infrastructure, and intellectual property, while millions are reduced to precarious labor or permanent redundancy. Technology creates immense social wealth, yet capitalism converts this abundance into artificial scarcity through unemployment, underemployment, and exclusion. The problem is not lack of capacity, but the private control of productive power. Capital uses technology to weaken collective resistance. Automation and digitalization create a reserve army of labor that discipline those still employed, forcing compliance through fear of replacement. Global supply chains, enabled by technology, pit workers across borders against one another, undermining solidarity. Platforms disguise employment relationships, reclassifying workers as independent contractors while exercising total control over their labor. Technology thus dissolves visible forms of domination while preserving exploitation in more abstract and difficult-to-resist forms. The ideology surrounding technology reinforces this domination. Progress is framed as inevitable, neutral, and beyond political control. Those displaced or exhausted by technological change are blamed for failing to adapt, retrain, or innovate. Structural violence is recast as personal inadequacy. Capital presents itself as the engine of progress, while obscuring the social relations that determine who benefits and who suffers. The question of ownership is erased, replaced by narratives of disruption and efficiency. Yet, technology reveals a deeper contradiction. The more advanced productive forces become, the more irrational capitalist relations appear. Society possesses the capacity to meet human needs with minimal labor, yet millions are forced to work excessively or not at all. Technology exposes the possibility of a world beyond scarcity, while capitalism enforces scarcity to maintain profit. The gap between what is technically possible and what is socially allowed widens, generating frustration, alienation, and crisis. Human liberation requires reclaiming technology from capital. Machines, algorithms, and systems of production must be subordinated to collective decision and social need. Technology should reduce necessary labor time, expand education, creativity, and leisure, and strengthen solidarity rather than competition. This transformation cannot occur while the means of technological development remain privately owned and directed by profit. As long as capital controls technology, progress will deepen domination rather than dissolve it, and innovation will continue to serve accumulation instead of human freedom, reproducing a system in which the most advanced tools ever created are used to perpetuate exhaustion, inequality, and unfreedom rather than enabling a society organized around shared abundance and conscious collective control over the conditions of life. Private ownership of the means of production is presented as a natural and efficient arrangement, yet it is the central mechanism through which workers are divided and inequality is continuously reproduced. By placing factories, land, technology, and resources under the control of a small owning class, capitalism ensures that the majority must compete with one another for access to life itself. This structure does not merely organize production, it organizes power. Ownership grants command, while dispossession enforces obedience, and from this imbalance flows both fragmentation among workers and the permanence of social inequality. When production is privately owned, workers are excluded from meaningful decision-making over the conditions and purposes of their labor. They enter the workplace already separated from the tools and resources necessary to produce independently. This separation forces workers into dependence on wages, making survival contingent on securing employment from those who own. The relationship between workers is therefore mediated by competition rather than cooperation. Each individual must struggle to sell their labor power, and this struggle pits workers against one another, instead of uniting them against the system that exploits them all. Private ownership thrives on this division. Wages are individualized, contracts differentiated, hierarchies imposed, and rewards distributed unevenly to prevent collective identification. Workers are sorted by skill, status, race, gender, and nationality, transforming structural exploitation into fragmented experiences. Inequality within the working class is not a flaw of capitalism, but a tool of governance. As long as workers compare themselves to one another rather than recognizing their shared dispossession, private ownership remains secure. The market reinforces this fragmentation by presenting outcomes as the result of merit rather than ownership. Those who struggle are told they lack effort or ability, while those who rise slightly above others are encouraged to identify with capital rather than labor. This illusion conceals the fact that no amount of individual advancement alters the underlying relation of ownership. A worker promoted into management may enforce exploitation more efficiently, but they do not escape the system that extracts value from labor as a whole. Private ownership converts inequality into aspiration, ensuring that hope replaces solidarity. At the same time, private ownership concentrates wealth on a massive scale. Because the products of collective labor are privately appropriated, value flows upward regardless of how production is socially organized. Entire communities generate wealth that is extracted and relocated elsewhere, leaving behind precarity, underfunded services, and dependency. The worker produces abundance, yet experiences scarcity, while the owner accumulates without labor. Inequality is not incidental. It is the predictable outcome of ownership, divorced from production. This concentration of wealth translates directly into political and cultural power. Owners shape laws, media, education, and ideology to normalize their dominance. They define what is realistic, what is possible, and what is desirable. Workers are told that inequality is inevitable, that ownership reflects risk and innovation, and that collective alternatives are dangerous or naive. These narratives reinforce fragmentation by discouraging collective imagination and portraying unity as a threat to order rather than a path to justice. Private ownership also weakens resistance by making employment insecure. The constant threat of unemployment disciplines workers into compliance. Those who resist face replacement by others who cannot afford refusal. This reserve army of labor, maintained by unequal access to resources, ensures that fear circulates throughout the working class. Fragmentation becomes a condition of survival, not a choice. Workers learn to protect themselves individually rather than challenge the system collectively. Yet production itself reveals the contradiction of private ownership. Modern production is deeply social, relying on cooperation, shared knowledge, and interdependence across vast networks of labor. No individual owner produces alone, yet ownership claims exclusive rights over outcomes created by many. This contradiction exposes private ownership as an obstacle rather than a necessity. The system depends on collective labor while denying collective control, generating inequality that grows alongside productivity. The persistence of inequality is therefore not a failure of redistribution but a consequence of ownership itself. As long as production remains privately owned, reforms can only soften the symptoms without altering the cause. Fragmentation will reappear in new forms, and inequality will regenerate through markets, wages, and accumulation. Workers will continue to be divided, ranked, and disciplined by a system that requires disunity to survive, a system in which shared labor creates private wealth, and collective effort sustains individual power while the many remain separated from one another, from the means of life, and from the possibility of organizing production around equality, cooperation, and common control over the conditions that shape human existence. Class consciousness emerges when workers recognize that their suffering is not an individual failure but a shared condition rooted in social relations of power. Capitalism works tirelessly to prevent this recognition by isolating individuals, framing exploitation as personal inadequacy, and disguising domination as opportunity. As long as workers interpret their exhaustion, insecurity, and poverty as private problems, the system remains intact. Class consciousness breaks this illusion by revealing the underlying structure that binds individual experiences together into a collective reality shaped by ownership, control, and exploitation. To become class conscious is to understand one's position within the process of production and within society as a whole. It is the realization that workers, despite differences in occupation, culture, or geography, share a common relation to capital. They do not own the means by which they live, and they must therefore sell their labor to survive. This shared condition creates shared interests that stand in direct opposition to those of the owning class. Without this understanding, resistance remains fragmented and easily absorbed by reforms that leave power untouched. Capital fears class consciousness because it transforms workers from isolated individuals into a historical force. Once workers recognize that wealth is produced collectively but appropriated privately, the legitimacy of capitalist rule begins to collapse. What was once accepted as natural begins to appear as imposed. What was once endured as inevitable is exposed as changeable. Consciousness does not arise automatically from hardship. It develops through struggle, discussion, organization, and the confrontation between lived experience and ideology. It is forged when workers see that the system cannot resolve their contradictions because it depends on them. Collective organization is the material expression of class consciousness. Awareness without organization remains powerless, while organization without awareness becomes directionless. Through unions, councils, cooperatives, and political movements, workers transform shared grievances into coordinated action. Collective organization allows workers to overcome the fragmentation imposed by competition and fear. It replaces isolation with solidarity and substitutes individual vulnerability with collective strength. What one worker cannot resist alone becomes possible when many act together. Organization changes the balance of power within society. Capital derives its strength from ownership and coordination, but labor possesses a latent power rooted in its indispensability. Production cannot function without workers. When organized collectively, workers can disrupt, negotiate, and reshape the conditions under which production occurs. This power is not granted from above. It is built from below through sustained effort, discipline, and unity. Collective organization teaches workers that power is not merely something imposed upon them, but something they can exercise together. Real freedom cannot exist within relations of domination. As long as workers remain dependent on selling their labor to survive, freedom is reduced to formal rights devoid of material substance. Class consciousness exposes this contradiction by showing that freedom requires control over the conditions of life, not merely the right to choose among forms of exploitation. Collective organization creates the possibility of this control by enabling workers to challenge ownership, demand democratic decision-making, and assert social priorities over private profit. The struggle for real freedom is therefore not a struggle for individual escape, but for collective transformation. Capitalism offers mobility to a few in order to preserve subordination for the many. Class consciousness rejects this false promise and insists that liberation must be shared, or it is meaningless. Workers cannot free themselves by rising above others within the system. They can only free themselves by abolishing the conditions that produce exploitation altogether. Collective organization turns this insight into practice by aligning action with shared interests rather than individual advancement. Through struggle, workers develop new capacities, identities. Organization becomes a school of democracy, teaching cooperation, debate, and collective responsibility. It challenges the logic of competition that capitalism enforces and replaces it with solidarity rooted in mutual dependence. In this process, workers begin to see themselves not as commodities or replaceable units of labor, but as conscious agents capable of shaping society. This transformation is itself an expression of freedom, not as an abstract ideal, but as lived social power. Class consciousness and collective organization do not guarantee immediate victory, nor do they eliminate conflict or sacrifice. They do, however, open the path toward a society in which production serves human needs rather than private accumulation. They make visible the possibility of a world organized around cooperation instead of domination. As workers come to understand their shared power and act upon it collectively, freedom ceases to be a distant promise and begins to take form as a practical movement that challenges the foundations of exploitation and asserts the right of the many to govern the conditions of their own lives, their labor, and their future within a historical process still unfolding through struggle and collective awakening. The truth revealed across all these contradictions is unmistakable: the system that promises freedom through productivity, progress, and private ownership delivers only deeper exploitation, alienation, and inequality. Capitalism expands human productive power while stripping workers of control over it, turning labor into a burden, technology into a weapon, and abundance into scarcity. The more society advances materially, the more unbearable its social relations become, because wealth is collectively created yet privately seized, and freedom is proclaimed while domination persists. This is not a temporary injustice, but a structural condition rooted in the private ownership of production and enforced through fragmentation, competition, and ideological deception. The resolution does not lie in working harder, adapting faster, or hoping for ethical rulers, but in recognizing that workers themselves are the true creators of social wealth, and therefore the only force capable of transforming society. When class consciousness replaces isolation and collective organization, replaces submission, the foundations of exploitation begin to crack. Real freedom emerges not as an abstract ideal, but as a material condition won through struggle, unity, and the conscious reorganization of production to serve human needs rather than profit, opening the path toward a society where labor is no longer alienated, technology no longer dominates, and the many reclaim power over the conditions of their own existence.